Australia, the sixth largest country on Earth. An ancient, rugged, and unforgiving land with abundant animal life, both beautiful and deadly. Found within its awe-inspiring landscapes and natural beauty exists a deep history of unexplained mysteries for anyone with the courage to investigate them. Tonight, we join Ben on a journey across this vast island continent in search of answers to events that have reshaped the lives of so many that have been exposed to Unexplained Phenomena Australia, with your host, Ben Hurl.
Hello and welcome to episode 6 of Unexplained Phenomena Australia. I'm your host, Ben Hurl, and thank you for joining me as tonight we delve deep into Australia's rich history of strange and unexplained phenomena. And tonight we're going to look at a really interesting UFO event. And this is a case that I've investigated personally, and it was indeed actually a lost case, as it's never been recorded anywhere other than in an old UFO journal, which recounted the encounter several months after it actually occurred. But apart from that, it's been really in no other documentaries or written about in books. It's just one of those really strong UFO cases that never really got beyond the UFO literature at that time. And if you didn't have a copy of that old journal, it's disappeared and you'd never hear about it. And so this encounter is a great example of bringing a cold case back to life so that people today can appreciate what happened. And the past for me is really important because, you know, how can we judge what's happening today without the clarity of what happened in the past? So, and unfortunately the records are far from complete. So they're scattered to the winds across different researchers, and information gets lost. And this one again is a car encounter, and so by that I mean the witnesses were driving when their lives were really forever changed by what they saw, and that's more than enough for the witnesses who had that encounter. But what about the rest of us? Where did this object come from? Why on earth was it in that location at that time? What was its purpose? Where did it go back to? And should we be concerned by the appearance of such objects? And an even bigger question than that is, will it come back again? So it's just that's why we need to keep a tab on what's happened in the past. You know, we need to know that if something like this object in tonight's episode appears again, we know that there was a time when something like that appeared in the past. Because at the moment we don't know where these objects come from. So they're extremely big questions that I always like to refer back to all the time. So in this particular case, the object was small. It wasn't big. It's not some huge craft. It's not hovering over Phoenix. It's not as big as a school bus or as big as a ship. It's a small object. The object showed intelligent control. So it behaved in a way that it was no natural phenomena at all. The object could hover magically in the air. It could just sit there and hover. And it could fly incredibly fast from point A to point B, back again, whatever it wanted to do. And the object predicted the witness's intentions, which is a common feature of a lot of UFO encounters, and we've seen that in previous weeks, where the objects seem to know what the witnesses are planning to do in advance of them doing it. So that's a really interesting aspect of UFO phenomena, in my opinion. And in this particular case, it demonstrated extremely frightening power, or potential power. And we'll get into that a little bit more as we travel along this journey tonight. And the witnesses were scared absolutely witless by this object. It was not a pleasant encounter for them at all. It's not standing out on the back porch looking at some pretty lights in the sky going, ooh, isn't that amazing? Oh, we don't know what it is, but gee, it's amazing. No, these witnesses were scared witless by what confronted them. And I think that was partly due to the fact that they never considered the possible existence of such objects in their respective, because there's two witnesses, in their respective worldviews. They wouldn't have thought about flying saucers, UFOs, UAPs. It just was not something that they would have even thought about. And after this encounter that I'm going to talk about tonight, the female witness never drove at night again by herself. She was completely terrified. And the area of the encounter, which is not far from where I live, has a sustained history of UFO interaction. And really, with more time and resources, a lot more could probably be revealed if the time and the money was there to go and really dig into it. And the location is remote. It's in Victoria. This case has occurred here in Victoria, southeastern Australia, in my home state. And when it occurred, which was in 1976, I was living very, very close to where it happened, probably about half an hour away. So it was very, very close to where we lived. And I checked with my father and I said, what would we have been doing at that time in 1976? And he estimated at the actual time of the encounter that we were on a train journey to Mildura, which is a town in the far north, opposite end of the state, on a trip to Mildura at that time, which disappointed me. But as I was only 6 at the time, 6 years old, it's unlikely that I would have been able to have done anything anyway at that time, even though I was quite interested in UFOs at that time. There was nothing I could have done. And also in 1976, there was no social media, no mobile phones, and the witnesses did not discuss what happened beyond their immediate family. So the encounter was always going to be one that risked the possibility of never seeing the light of day. And I was extremely fortunate, very fortunate, that a family member encouraged the witnesses to report the encounter to Viewforce, the Victorian UFO Research Society, which was the active UFO group in this state at that time. So that was lucky. If that hadn't been done, this amazing case would have completely just disappeared. And as investigators and fellow investigators out there, you will be so crucially aware of this, that it doesn't take much for great data, great reports to not even make it to your front door. So they did report it to Viewforce, and the local investigator, that's the East Gippsland investigator at that time, his name was Dan Haylock. He travelled to the region and he interviewed the witnesses, and that's how the report was done for the old UFO journal. But unfortunately, Dan passed away about 3 or 4 years ago, and I missed the opportunity to discuss the incident with him. And he only lived down in Paynesville, which is only a 10-minute drive from where I am right now. And so I never got the opportunity to meet him, to discuss this incident with him, or to perhaps view his notes and research. He may have recorded the interviews on a tape at that time. And I did manage to find out that all his UFO research ended up being dumped in the rubbish by family members after his passing. And again, this was always a risk with UFO information. And I just didn't get to him in time. So we're able to score some of his other books, but his research notes for all his years of investigating local cases had actually been thrown to the local rubbish dump. So that's a tragedy, because that stuff's gone and it's not coming back. So therefore, I knew that if this case was going to see the light of day again, that I had to get my boots on, get out there and try, from all these years later, to try and find out what happened and uncover it all. And so when I read about this encounter, I was instantly excited by it, as it ticked a few of my boxes for cases that I think are really worthy of investigation. So, as I've said in other episodes, what do I think makes a good case? Strange and unusual objects. Yes. Physical evidence. Multiple and ideally independent witnesses. Reasonable timeframes for the encounter, not just simply a flash in the sky. You want a case that occurred over a period of time. Could be 5 minutes, could be 5 hours, but as long as there's some sustained time period that's passed. Ideally, I like animal reactions and affected environments. And this case has got some of those features, but not all of them. So as we discuss it tonight, you'll see which of those aspects that I really, really like do belong to this particular case. And it's slightly different to other road cases that I've discussed, but that it also shares similarities. So that sort of consistency that you see across reports of cars interacting with UFOs on the road. And it definitely presented some of the key challenges of UFO investigation, which is being there at the right time and place. UFOs can appear anywhere, anytime. And the chances of me being available at the time of them appearing are slim to non-existent. For example, I was 6 years old at the time of this case. There's not much a 6-year-old can do. It could occur on the opposite side of the state. And I've always said that ghost hunters have got that distinct advantage over crypto and UFO researchers, and the fact that they can go down to the old asylum and sit there and put the equipment out and something may appear, but at least they've got a contained audience where it should occur. But with UFO research, crypto research, it can be anywhere, and you just have to be there at the right place and the right time. Physical trace cases are infrequent, and this is not necessarily a physical trace case. It's a strong witness experience, and it brings into the question about witnesses knowing what they're viewing. Detangling, misinterpreting, what they're looking at. For example, the ISS or aircraft or whatever. But once I recount the details of this, you'll instantly see that this is nothing of those mundane style explanations. Will cover it off. There's no photos or videos in 1976 at the location. That people just didn't have that sort of equipment. They might have had a basic camera at best, but under the circumstances, they didn't have a camera with them at the time. So we don't have to ponder over whether it's birds, insects, or lens flares or anything like that. So in some ways, that's a good thing. It's definitely not a hoax. I have met met one of the witnesses, and it's just not a hoax or a delusion. And with cold cases, the big challenge is obviously witnesses moving away, dying, losing interest. This is a big problem with cold cases, being able to find them, whether they were believers or non-believers. And these guys were definitely non-believers. They didn't even think about this sort of thing. And they're not, and I would describe them not being prone to exaggeration, to saying that this, blowing it out of proportion as to what they experienced. And we're not so much dealing with, like rival researchers here, or like no one else has invested. The guy who investigated this was a really nice gentleman, and he would have been more than happy to have discussed what he had seen. He wasn't hoarding information and keeping it to himself. So the challenge of this particular case is dealing with lost information. So the information is just not there. But I love the fact that I was really able to sink my teeth into this case, and I did the investigation in 2015. So hasn't been done in recent times. So recent history, but not as in like this year or last year. So I've been to the locations, found the witnesses, both of them. I've written an article about this particular case, and we made a video on it as well. And it opened up the possibility of future investigations. So it really did, for myself, fire me up and go, right, this is a case that I really, really think is important. A case that runs the risk of completely disappearing. And it's just a great, exciting UFO encounter in the classic sense of that word. It really is. And what I love about it is the fact that the extraordinary does choose to enter our lives. And it's usually when we least expect that to happen. And it definitely demonstrates that the boundaries of our reality are extremely pliable, and the edges of it can fray, allowing amazing events to occur, and usually to ordinary people as they go about their business. And this situation has occurred many, many times to people all over Australia and around the world. And the witnesses are forever changed by the magnitude of such encounters. It's just really mind-blowing encounters. Ordinary life meets the extraordinary, and you've got a clash of realities that is truly, truly altering, often frightening, and always puzzling. So, and as an investigator, I'm looking for cases that fit this profile, and if I can find them in my local area, even better. And this case first came to my attention by a member of my old group, Victorian UFO, VUFOA, Victorian UFO Action. And this was a team member. His name was Anthony Hadgen. And he gave me an old copy of the Australian Flying Saucer Review from 1976. And he pointed out to me that there was an interesting case that had occurred in my region, East Gippsland, Victoria, Australia. And this, the transfixion of UFOs is always there. And when it's a local case, I just go crazy. It's just like, oh, fantastic. It's a local case. It's not in Queensland. It's here. Fabulous. And it's great to read about the big UFO cases around the world, the Roswells and the Rendleshams, and I've read books and watched the documentaries and all of that. Absolutely fascinated by it. And they really are incredible. But it becomes more exciting to me, and probably other people around the world, when a good case occurs in your own local area. This shows that the phenomena does not simply appear in faraway places. It can and does occur locally. And if you look hard enough, you'll see that the UFOs at some point in time have been to your local area. They have been. There's just no doubt about it. So I encourage you, and I say this all the time, dig deeply into your local community, and you may be surprised as to what you find. And I was really surprised when I was able to find this particular case. So I was delighted when Tony showed me the old Flying Saucer Review with such a great local event. And I read it avidly, and it met all those criteria that I want when I'm looking for them. The people doing something mundane, a regular task that is interrupted by a visit from the exceptional, in a remote area. The people who live in these areas are very down-to-earth sort of people, and they're not interested in fame or silly games. They're honest and hardworking, and they're not prone to flights of fancy. That's why I always say police officers, farmers, they're great witnesses, because they just ain't got time for mucking around. They just haven't. So I love it when it occurs in those particular occupations. And the traits of the object that was reported is aspects that are interesting to me or slightly unusual. When compared to many other UFO encounters, an example of that would be the Burke's Flat Ron Sullivan 4th of April 1966 case, where his car headlights were bent off the road. That object divided into two halves with tubes of light passing between them. And it's an unusual sight. And the fact that the object bent his headlights off the car, that grabbed my attention in that particular case. So there's an unusual aspect to the encounter. That's why I'm not such a fan of lights in the sky, because there's just not so much you can do with that stuff. And we really are all beyond lights in the sky. We want the stuff that's got a lot more bite to it, a lot more meat to it, something with a much higher intensity. And cases like Ron Burke's Flat and this encounter really do tick those boxes really, really well, which is amazing. So this object tonight is really interesting. It's not your typical UFO. In fact, it almost seems to be like a probe or a remote controlled object that was here on a search and reconnaissance duties. But we'll go into greater detail on that a bit later. So intriguing. And there's nothing quite like a nighttime encounter for me. You've got to love the night. The night is here to humble everybody. And every man believes in God after dark. Because we used to be eaten by big cats thousands of years ago. So there's a certain innate fear that humans hold about the night. It's definitely there. And on a dark country road, close to midnight, we all pray for a safe and uneventful journey, and our pulse quickens and sweat beads appear on our brow if we break down or if we hit an unfortunate animal crossing the road. If you find yourself on a dark country road and the exceptional appears, then you certainly won't be ready for that, and your senses will be on high alert, and your eyes won't believe what's they're presenting for your brain to process, and you'll be forever changed. You will join the ranks of the aware, and your future trips into the night will forever have a heightened apprehension, and you will grip your steering wheel tight, glance nervously into the rearview mirror as the shadows loom and dance around you on your journey as you drive through the night. So what I'm saying by that is, put yourself in the witness's position and imagine you're them encountering what they're encountering. And so this encounter occurred in a remote part of the Victorian High Country, near a small town with an unusual name called Dargo, D-A-R-G-O, Dargo. And it's tucked away in the remote part of the Victorian Great Dividing Range, the mountain range that we have here. It's an isolated region of breathtaking natural beauty, a true gem of an area in the heart of Victoria. And it's an area that's popular with fishermen, hunters, tourists, motorbike riders, dirt bike riders, day trippers. And the area has clean rivers intersected with farmland and impenetrable wilderness as well. And if you ever get the chance, be sure to visit the region, because you'll be glad you did. It's just really beautiful country up there. And it's just become so popular over the last 20, 30 years. People go there all the time now. So it's kind of losing a little bit of the remoteness that it had, even though the town itself is still very small. It's got like a pub, a hotel. So it's got like 2 pubs, a motel, and a general store, and a scattering of houses. So it's not big. It's not big. There'd only be a few hundred people that live there on a full-time basis. And the weekenders, they come and go. And so this encounter occurred at 11 p.m. on the 28th of January, 1976. So 11 p.m., 28th of January, 1976. 2 farmers, a young man and his middle-aged female cousin, were harvesting a gherkin patch, which is like pickles. So pickles that you put in your hamburger, those little green pickles, that's what they were harvesting. And I've picked them myself as a child, and it's terrible work, hard work. You bend down over vines and you're picking these pickles, or these gherkins as we call them here. And you're chucking them in a bucket, and it's hot. There's spiders under there. There could be snakes. It's just a really hard work. And after each day's pick, they turned on a water pump before they left for home, so the crop would get a good soaking of water. And each night, so every night, they would return at about 11 o'clock to turn the pump off. And on this particular evening, as they left the Dargo township, they noticed what they thought was a shooter's spotlight off to their side. And they soon saw that it was in fact a light that was travelling just above the treetops. And it began to pace the car next to them, this light. And it followed them, pacing the car side by side as they drove out of the town and started heading up into the hills. And they reached a deep cutting, which is where the road basically passes through a hillside, and there's these steep cliffs either side of the road, where basically the road's been dug through a hill. So once they reached this deep cutting, they lost sight of the object. They couldn't see it anymore because it was off to their right. And for the next mile, the road wound through a deeply wooded area. So they didn't see the object after they went through this cutting. And this cutting is probably about maybe 7 or 8 minutes out of town. So it's not that far away. And the object, they described it as being about the size of the full moon and the colour similar to the moon. It definitely wasn't the moon. And they had to leave the main Dargo road and turned off onto a gravel road on the right-hand side. And they had to cross over a small, narrow wooden bridge and began to climb up a steep hill on the other side. So they've left the main road, they've gone down over a little bridge, and they've gone up a steep hill on the opposite side. Not real steep, but just a hill. And I'll show you some photos as we go along. So they noticed that the light had appeared again. So here's this damn light. And over a semi-cleared field onto their right, the object appeared. And it was pacing their car like it had when they first left town. The object sped up, increased its speed, and it zoomed off ahead of the car. So it shot straight up the road, off to the right-hand side, to the top of the hill, where it waited. It waited for the car to catch up. So it's come around the side when they've gone through the wooded area. It's seen the car heading up the hill. It's made contact with the car again, and it's taken off and gone to the top of the hill, where it's sitting there waiting for the car to catch up. And as the car reached the top of the hill, there was a gate on the right-hand side, and the object was hovering just above this gate. And at this point, the witnesses could see that the object appeared to be a small sphere about 2 feet across, with 2 fins coming out horizontally on each side and 2 more fins underneath it at the 45-degree angle. So a total of 4 fins, round object, 2 horizontal fins, and two 45-degree fins underneath it, with basically a big eye on the front of it. So not like an eye with an iris, but like a glowing eye or a glowing light on the front. And this little object, this little 2-foot wide object, emitted a terrific blast of light, which lit up the entire valley like daylight. They described it as lighting up the night sky to the level of the sun, that they could see everything. There was no shadows. It lit up the entire area. And they described the light as feeling cold and warm. And as the light swamped the car in its dazzling glare, the fact that a 2-foot wide object could emit such a blast of light is really amazing, and a really key feature of this particular case that makes it very interesting. You know, the object's small stature, as in it's only 2 foot across, and its powerful beam, to me suggested that this was some sort of a probe, that this probably didn't have beings in it. I don't know that, but it was only 2 foot. It was only a 2-foot sphere. So it was either it could have been a probe or a reconnaissance vehicle. The witnesses did not stop their car, and they continued on over the hill. and they began to descend down the other side. So they've come over the bridge, up the hill, the object's on the right at the gate, and they've continued down the hill, and the road winds down. So the gravel road weaved to the left and to the right, and a bank of about 30 feet height was on their right, so that went up a hill, and a steep drop off was on their left as the road wound down. And the object continued on the right hand side, still emitting this tremendous blast of light and energy. And that's what I was talking about before when I spoke about the fact that it seemed to be a display of power. So this thing's got extreme power. It's displaying this humongously bright lit area, and it's following them with this bright light blasting the entire valley. And it maintained its altitude as it followed the car along the winding road. And the witnesses came down to the first gate that they had to open and cross the paddock on a rough, or the field on a rough track, to where their crop was, to turn this water pump off. So they didn't give up on the mission. This thing's, this terrifying object's appeared, but they're still going to turn the water pump off. And the object, it just paced them, but at a much greater altitude and with less light at this point in time. And the female witness got out and she opened the gate, and they drove down to where the sheds were and where the pump was located. And the object followed them, and the female got out of the car, looking up at the object. And as she's looking at the object, she races over and she turns off the pump and jumped back into the car. And the witnesses were frightened, terrified, as they felt that the object was going to pace them again. So it's hovering above the car as she's turning off the water pump. So they drove back across the field at 60 miles an hour. And the object did indeed follow them as they quickly reopened the gate and followed their route, the exact same route, heading back towards home. So they've come through the gate, they've shut the gate, and they've driven back up the road that they came down. And as they got to the top of the hill, where the gate had been, at the top of the hill, the object again emitted a tremendous blast of light, lighting up the entire valley like daylight. And the witnesses sped back down the hill, over the small bridge, squealed the car tyres back onto the main road, the main tarred road, and they passed another car and drove promptly into Dargo. And the small, strange object was not seen again. When they got home, the female witness's mother noticed the fear on their faces and their shaken appearance. And the family also noticed a strange glow over the mountain range from their house a few nights later, and they wondered if their mysterious visitor was still exploring the wilderness around Dargo. That's the basic facts of the case. And it's just so good. It's so strong. It really is. You've got this little object flying around, pacing a car, terrifying the occupants of the car, and demonstrating huge power and ability and intelligent control. So I really enjoyed that, and I wanted to follow it up. And the original article had no names in it at all. The witnesses, it just didn't give any names, but it had fairly good specifics on the geography of the area, such as the cutting that they drove through, on the way to the farm, the little bridge that they crossed. So I set about the task of getting onto Google Maps and having a look around at the roads leading out of Dargo. And the article did not give any clues as to which direction the encounter occurred in, north, south, east, west. It didn't give you any idea on that. But my instincts were keeping me towards the east because I'm from the area. I sort of probably had that advantage in the fact that I sort of know the area, not intimately, but well enough to know where they probably could have been. And I street walked the Dargo area on Google Maps, classic armchair research in every direction, until I did find a deep cutting. And I felt I was in the right area. And the next was the search for the little bridge. And I did find a little bridge. At this point, I was feeling confident that I was on the right track, yet there were still some doubts. For example, the geography around the bridge that I'd found on Google Maps did not quite fit the description in the original report. So that was a little problematic. And This is where armchair ufology and boots on the ground needed to part ways. And so on the 9th of May 2015, I set out for Dargo to go drive the roads and see if I could find the locations. Google Maps and Google Earth is very useful, but there's nothing like being on the location to check your theories out. And the road to Dargo is a sealed one and in good condition. And Dargo is a location that you drive into and out of again. And it does have roads that pass through up into the mountains, the high mountains, but they're gravel roads and they're closed during the winter. And you don't, people, unless you've got four-wheel drives and you're right into that, you're not going to go up there. So a lot of people drive into Dargo and drive out on the main road. And they're not, and those other roads aren't suitable for heavy traffic. And Dargo is in fact one of the most isolated towns in Victoria. It really is. And that's what makes it perfect for UFOs. And from my research, it appears that the region does have a really good history of UFO events over the years, not just simply lights in the sky stuff either. The road's winding and it passes through really magnificent scenery and river views. And once I got to Dargo, I began to retrace what I believe was the route that the witnesses took. And I set off from the Dargo pub and followed the road again east out of Dargo. And I saw the area where the light most likely first appeared. And I soon found the deep cutting in the road. And I passed through it and I was driving through a heavily wooded area where the witnesses had lost sight of the light. And I came around a corner and I saw a little bridge, but I drove past that to the spot where I had spotted this first bridge on Google Maps, as that was the location I wanted to check out first. So I passed one bridge to go to this other bridge. And when I got to there, I saw that the initial doubts that I had were correct. This bridge was on private land and the geography behind it was steep hills and did not match the description at all, as relayed by the witnesses in their account. So I gave up on this area as being the location, and I continued on down the road to the Crooked River Road, and I turned left up that dirt road. And it was here that things started to look a bit more promising, as off to the right was fertile farming land next to the river. And I followed the Crooked River and stopped several times to muse as to where the likely location of that gherkin patch could have been. And I felt strongly that I had to be in the right place. There's a river here, there's flat, fertile land where you could easily have grown corn, gherkins, anything you like at that time. And I drove along the Crooked River Road and a little further and soon came to an intersecting track that led back to the main Dargo Road. And it's named Shortcut Track. That's the name of the road. And at the end of the track, there was a farm gate. So that was promising. And it looked very much like the one that the female witness would have had to have gotten out to open. And I followed the track back to the main Dargo Road. And when I got to the intersection, I saw that little bridge, that other little bridge that I'd passed earlier. And this was the right bridge. And I knew that I had the right road, Shortcut Track. That was the name of the road that the witnesses had been driving on. Not listed in any of the information that was available. I turned around and I followed the road back in the direction that the witnesses would have been travelling. I crossed the little bridge, I went up the hill, noted the semi-cleared land on the right-hand side where the object had reappeared after the witnesses had lost sight of it. I drove to the top of the hill, and there on the right was the farm gate where the object had waited and hovered above, and where it shone its terrific blast of light onto the witnesses as their car drove past that gate. The road did indeed zigzag down the other side of the hill with a steep drop off to the left and a 30-foot steep bank on the right, and down to the intersection of the Crooked River Road, to the farm gate that led down to the fertile lands next to the Crooked River. So it was great to know that I had found the exact route the witnesses had taken on that night, 28th of January, 1976. So, extremely isolated area. And the area is isolated now in 2022. And it would have been even more so back in 1976. That would have been a really isolated area. You drive on it now, you go there today, there's no houses on that road. It's still very, very, very remote and probably looks exactly the same. But 1976 was just, to me, a more primitive time than now. So I think it would have been a very lonely place back then. And the track was the perfect location for the object to observe the witnesses as they travelled down to turn off that water pump. And they described it as being higher in the sky when they were down at the water pump. And having driven on that track, my observation was that the object remained at the same altitude as the highest part of the road, which is over the gate. And as the road descended to the river flats, the object just remained at the same relative altitude and just simply drifted out, observing them as it went straight out across to being in line with the river, where the witnesses turned around again and it followed them at the same altitude back to the highest geographic point, where it shone that huge light on them again for the second and final time. And so the exercise of driving along these roads also highlighted to me the limitations of Google Maps, as the correct bridge on Google Maps was obscured by the canopy of the trees. So if you're looking at it from Google Maps, you can't see that little bridge. You don't know that it's there because all the trees totally obscure it. So it would be impossible to use that as a sole investigative tool to track everything down. And it's only by getting in the car and driving the roads that the true location, based on the geographic descriptions from the witnesses, leaps out and comes to life. And being able to go to that exact location and travel the route in real time, in the same amount of time that they did, gave me a greater understanding of the area, and I could really feel how the witnesses would have felt on that night, really understand it. And I returned to here to Bairnsdale at the end of the day, very satisfied with the progress that I'd made. And I felt that I was bringing the case back to life after such a long time. And the fact that, like many UFO events, it ran the risk of being forgotten, as it was only recorded in that journal. This case was strong, with dramatic interaction between the witnesses and the object, and it simply was not just a lights in the sky encounter. So the next step was obvious: find the witnesses. And so that night on Facebook, I posted a brief piece about the case and some of the images that I'd taken on that day. And I was glad that I did, as one of my local friends contacted me and said that they were from Dargo and knew many people in the area. And the next day I went to their house and discussed the case and other strange happenings in the area, including Yowie activity. And my friend gave me her aunt's contact details, who actually lived in Dargo and had done for most of her life. And crucially, a name that her aunt mentioned as being a person who had a strange encounter with a light one night many years ago. One of her neighbours happened to have had a strange encounter with a light many years ago. So this was looking really promising. And I called my friend's auntie and made arrangements to return to Dargo the following Saturday, because I work full time, on the 16th of May 2015. And I visited the auntie mid-afternoon. And she took me to the lady's house, where the luck was just incredible. This was the house of the female witness. And she was at that time 83 years old by the time I got to her. She was in her mid-40s at the time, and then she's like 83 when I finally got to talk to her about this incident. And my contact told me that the witness would be reluctant to discuss the case, so it took a bit of get-to-know-you chat before we could even broach the UFO topic. So even though she was in her 40s at the time and 83 by the time I got to talk to her, she remembered it vividly, absolutely vividly. And she was born and had lived in Dargo her entire life. So she had a fairly encapsulated life in that town, hadn't really been a lot of other places. And what she and her cousin encountered on that evening was well outside their combined views of what was possible in the world. And the witnesses were very scared. And she instinctively knew it was not meant to be there and that the light was indeed really strange. The main impression that she was able to impart was that the light was orange in colour, and when it shone the terrific blast, everything became hot while in the glare of the massive beam. Absolutely, she said she was so scared that she tried not to look at the light and really wished that it would go away. And the fear that she faced was visible on her face as she recounted that experience, again, very reluctantly. And I reassured her that no harm had come to her, and it's likely that the object meant her no harm. And it appeared to be simply curious about them driving around in the middle of the night, which is quite a common feature of UFO reports. They are very, very curious. And so the rest of the afternoon was your typical conversation talking about how to cook walnuts and cakes and all that sort of stuff. And I realised that I'd gotten all I was going to get out of her. And at 83, she's not really sort of still, like talking about, want to talk about this for very long at all. And that And that night I returned to the location on dusk where the gate was, where the object had hovered and sat there in the darkness and just really soaked in that atmosphere. And I did get the full name of the male cousin, and the next step was to make contact with him. And it appeared that he was in the local area as well. And I found his phone number in the phone book and contemplated calling him. And I saw that from his address, he actually lived within 100 metres from my house at the time. And I chuckled at the fact that in all the weeks I'd spent reviewing the case, it appeared that he was in fact right under my nose the whole time. But this time I ran out of luck. I called him and his wife answered the phone, and I explained who I was and what I was calling about. And she went off to talk to him. And after an extended time, she came back to the phone and explained that he was not interested in discussing the encounter with me. And I felt shattered and upset, as I'd never been rejected before, but I had to respect his wishes to not discuss the incident. And I left my contact details in case he changed his mind, but that hasn't changed to this date. And I learned a valuable lesson at that time as an investigator. These events can be really traumatic for witnesses, and discussing them can be uncomfortable. And they feel they may be subjected to ridicule, and most likely have experienced that. So to receive a call out of the blue would have come as a surprise, and I don't blame him for refusing to discuss the encounter, having been lucky enough to sit down with the female witness and seeing firsthand her reluctance and fear. It's plainly clear they were both traumatized and fearful of their encounter with the unknown. And they certainly did not seek me out to recount the experience. So I had to bear that in mind too. I was looking for them. And I was even extremely lucky to have even spoken to one of them. And that was ultimately due to a connection from another friend. So as far as the witnesses were concerned, the event was best not spoken about, and even better to be forgotten, but I highly doubt that was possible for either of them. So it really was an incredible encounter. And the woman who I'd met up in Dargo, who was the auntie of my friend, she told me about encounters that their family had had. And I might talk about them at another time. These other events really were occurring. And so this whole case highlights how many good encounters that there actually are out there, and the fact that these events can be forgotten, or worse, not reported at all. And UFO investigators are just needed to take it to the streets and find Australia's or America's hidden history. Go to the locations, find the witnesses, reconstruct the record of these events so they are not lost forever. And as this event discussed tonight involved farmers, simple living folk, who were lucky, in my opinion, to have had that encounter with an unknown object that shouldn't have been in the area or anywhere else. And as I stared into the female witnesses, I could see that fear and impact that it had on her nearly 40 years later. And it's still very real for her. It's a real encounter for her. And in that moment, it became real for me as well. When I was looking into her eyes, I could see her fear. I could see her stress, and I felt it. So that gave me that fear of that event. So these events do happen. They are real encounters. And as an investigator, I live for these opportunities to travel the lonely roads and descend into the dark, imagining that sphere flying around with fins, following my car in the night, and I can see it following my car. And it would be great if you also can think about that. So in closing, I'm just going to show you a few images around that event. So this is where the area is. Dargo is in the middle of the map there, and that blue line, that dark blue line, that's leading back to Bairnsdale, where I'm based, and you can see Melbourne off to the left. So that's the area. And this is the house that they left from to go up to the area. It's just a little old wooden house, and she still lives there to this day. That was the family house. And this is the cutting that they drove through on that night. And off to the right is where the object, where they lost the object. As they descended down that hill, there's a treed area there. And this is where the main Dargo road goes to the left, and the little bridge is just down on that dirt road to the right. And this picture here gives you a better picture of that little bridge that they they actually drove over on that night. So you can see it's a remote wooden area. And this one shows you shortcut track. So that dirt road there that's running down the tree line, that's the road where they were traveling. And that yellow line down on the right-hand side, that's the main Dargo road. And this shows you basically where the gate was. So where the road dissects off to the left, you can see a little track that winds out into that green paddock. That's where the gate was. And this one here shows where from the gate leading down to where the farm gate was, where she had to get out of the car and cross the field down to there. And this map shows that gate, and that's the field they were driving across with the object following them. And this is the paddock where the gherkin field was, down near the river, and you can see the river running through on the left-hand side, the crooked river. So that's a good look at the locations. So we made a video, and in that video, this is me on location, standing just on the other side of that bridge. And I'm discussing at that point where the object was flying on the opposite side of the road. And this is the road that they drove up once they came over that bridge. And this is a little bit further up, and you can see off to the left how it's a cleared area, and it's a wooded area where I'm standing with the dirt road coming up. And so that little light was flying up where that green paddock is. It was pacing that car up there. And this is one of my favorite photos. This is the actual gate and the actual intersection where that object was hovering above that particular gate. And it really gives you goosebumps to know that that's where it shone its bright, bright light over the car. And you can see the road that just travels around in the back of the picture there. And that's where they continued stoically down to go down and turn off that water pump. And this is me standing at the gate that leads down to the where the gherkin field was and where the water pump was, which from there is probably about another half a kilometre away. It could be as far as that, at least a few hundred metres. And you can just see the real beauty of that area too. When you look past that gate, you can see how they are lovely green fields out there and those absolutely amazing mountains in the background. So it's an absolutely, really incredibly beautiful area. And I can just imagine myself hopping out of the car, opening that gate as this little strange object is hovering above them. So I thought I would actually draw a picture of what I think the object looks like, how I pictured it in my mind. And last night I sat down and just put together a quick sort of pencil sketch of it. And that's what gets me so excited about this case, is that this object, I reckon, is an unusual object. I've not heard of a similar one being reported before in any other case. And so that's another thing I really, really like about it. And I'll share it with you now. So I drew that last night, and you can see it's that little round sphere. It's got the two protrusions off horizontally and the two down at 45-degree angle, and it's shining that absolutely brilliantly bright light down onto that car as it's traveling along. So it just really, I can just see that so clearly in my mind's eye, and I thought I better draw that image. And here's the one we made for the video, which is a little bit more computer-based appearance. I kind of prefer my drawing as being representational of that object. So thank you so much for joining me on tonight's episode. I really hope that you enjoyed hearing about this case as much as I actually enjoyed investigating it. I do regard it as one of my great achievements in UFO research is that this case has not been lost. It still is viewable. I did an article on it in the Ufologist magazine at the time, the 1976 Dargo Victoria UFO Incident. So I wrote about it in that magazine, and it's on YouTube as well, the Dargo UFO Incident. So you can probably find that video if you'd like to see it. So thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you on next week's episode. Have a great night.